Still getting set up over here. Kind of a hot day. Hot day here today. In California, it's getting hotter. It's also my fault I left the door open. Anyway. Do I have announcements? I might not. Let me see. Well, I've changed my setup slightly. You might have noticed it's on this lovely dinner tray here, which I put outside in my patio. By the way, if you have any interest in streaming / just having something handy for using your phone as a camera, I highly recommend grabbing yourself one of these magnetic, these things right here. This lets you straight up just attach, if you stick a, like a metal plate that it comes with onto your phone case, it just snaps right on. I found this to be the easiest solution for when I need just like a quick camera available for these kinds of videos and other things like that. If I need somebody to be, have a mic stand. I also have these attachments which allow me to pop these on and off instead of having to screw them in. Still figuring out who's watching, so I don't know if this is relevant to you, but I've noticed that among the Octatrack community, there's a lot of people who like sharing, so, more power to you, If you have questions about sharing, never hesitate to ask in chat or otherwise. Yeah, so I'm using this dinner tray thing because I had this set up on the floor, and I actually really like how it all fits together into this tray. There's some slight, things that stick out, but really not a problem. And yeah, I tried to use this outside. It got really hot, so I brought it inside. I'll probably try doing a couple streams outside eventually once I have like the setup outside properly. The trick is having it all connect back to a decent connection. Which, let me see if I'm even on a decent connection right now. I am, right. So my 5G might not extend outside is the problem. So streaming becomes a bit of an issue. But, cool videos. Anyway. Question about something I did last week. About playing long samples but pausing them at a point. Oh, yeah. I'll let you finish your question and I'll continue. Yeah, I've been playing with using LFOs. Hans, welcome. Been playing with LFOs as a way of choosing slices in a breakbeat. So right now I have this, quick 2-bar phrase. Without an LFO, it's just a single slice. But as I increase the depth of my LFO, which is, you can take a look at this and maybe pause your screen if you have anything you want to look at further. But I'm basically using it to modify the slice point that's being triggered. And at the moment, it's triggering at the same exact speed as the number of slices. So you're getting basically a chopped up version of the beat here. And then as I move the crossfader, I can speed up the LFO. You can see it actually speed up. And I'm also using the fader fox here. I have it mapped to volume, high pass, low pass, release. I mean, it's technically not high pass, low pass. It's like Octatrack's little bass width thing. Controls these two knobs. And then this release thing, which has been kind of fun. The key is really finding a place to anchor the beat. Cool. So I don't know if you finished your question, Nick, but that is the case. I'm using, for a lot of these tracks in my set, I'm using the first trig condition to trigger long form samples, so that when I move on to another pattern, it will, yeah, okay. So maybe I'll just let you finish typing. General background of what I'm doing here. I've created this whole project based on stuff that happened after quarantine, including recordings from friends, samples that I decided to just pull the trigger and buy on Sample Magic and on Splice, because I don't use Splice very much. Like I noticed I was really busy during, like everyone else, I was busy doing a lot of things. And I had Splice with the intention of using it a lot and downloading samples. And I figured that, if I don't use it now, then I can just go ahead and buy those samples later on once like the number of credits have rolled in over time. So I actually went and did that. This time I had like 300 or 400 credits left over from like previous months. And I just put them all into this folder called Self-Isolation. Self-Isolation. And there's just like a bunch of slowly accumulating samples and ideas that are mostly unfinished, or I've got like recordings of people talking and talking about this particular experience. And I've created around, I want to say like 8 or 9 ideas, if not more. Personally, I think I'm reaching the end. If you were here on Monday, I feel like I had lost a little bit of steam. I don't know if that was coming through, but I was kind of just like, I feel like I've already done the things that I want to do, and I want to glue everything together. Forced captivity. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to take this time to figure out, to sort of explore our own brains and like lean into that headspace and be like, what do we create in this space? What's on my mind? Because sometimes asking yourself is not the most direct way to find out what you're thinking. It's like it puts too much pressure on what you make and not enough on like listening to yourself. Anyway, out of curiosity. Oh, Nick finished his question. I'll finish that real quick. Okay. So let me get this question together. Say you have the long spoken word track, trigger on step 1 is first condition trig. Then it gets to this end pattern when you set a conditional trig clock to rate and volume. Yeah, p lock to rate and volume, which pauses the words. Then another trig condition on step 3, set to not first to stop it playing. But how do you get it to continue on the next pattern? Like, how does it know to start off at the last pause point? That's my question. I would say, well, first of all, let's jump to one of those sequences. And actually, one thing that I will bring up in the context of what we're talking about here, actually, we'll go to Bank 5. This is a track that I worked on last week. If you were here, you'll recognize the birds, and it's my own voice.
The space is hard to find because it exists between the places we go on purpose. Less a destination than a place I found myself.
Right. So in this case, this is a bit of a simple version of what I'm describing and what Nick is asking about. I have a trig here. It's set to first, which means that this trigger will only apply when I press play on this pattern, and also every time I return to this pattern. So I could be in the middle of a performance, play this, and then go to pattern 6 or something, go back to pattern 3, and it will play again, because that's the first time that pattern is being played that time. There are other cases where the first trigger will not work. Say if you have your master trig, if your master sequence, like here, is shorter than the length of the pattern where it'll repeat, then something, in the octatrack basically doesn't understand the first command, and it will play it again every single time. So like, since this sequence is set to a quarter of 16, or like, it's basically set to like 4 times as much space as 16 is. So I mean, 16 at 1/4 meter, or I don't even know how to describe that, but 1/4 sort of like resolution.
The space
is the same as 64 at 1:1 resolution.
The space is hard to find because it exists between the places we go on.
But if I say went to 32 here, like that, then the pattern doesn't have enough room to go back, and it will essentially replay this pattern, this particular section, as though it was the first time every time.
The space is hard to find.
So it's going to repeat
because it exists
right after
between
this.
the places we go on purpose. The space is hard to find.
Kind of a weird fluke. I don't know if it's a fluke. Maybe the electron people know more. But moving on from that, this is different from the first trig condition, or this is different from doing like a one-shot trig, which I haven't used them in so long. Function trig, because you have to manually rearm those after you've played them. So they will only work the first time until you choose to rearm them, or until you press stop twice, I think. Okay, so my little secret with all of this is that I don't usually tell it to well, actually, let me go to this pattern, because this is a better example of what you're talking about. I have a few instances where I have this sample of def, and once the trigger gets to this point, so basically I'm playing my long form sample in track 5, and this is also like at 16 at a quarter resolution, because I like to see where we are in a longer period of time within one sequence, so I'm not like scrolling through pages.
I refuse to put my already vulnerable people in more danger by arming my music with aimless anger.
So this is going to stop the sample?
Activating them.
Yeah, so all I did here was, and I was working on this yesterday, I didn't actually record this, but I was playing with this beat that I had made either last week or 2 weeks ago, and I noticed that I wanted to play with the timing a little bit just to see how it feels against the beat, and so I started messing with these pauses and resumes, which I essentially just do by creating a trigless trig. I set the rate to 0 so that the sample pauses, and essentially you can imagine the playhead for this. It's still like the brain of the octatrack is still playing it. It's just playing it at 0 speed. And as long as you don't trigger something else on this track, it will keep that information. As long as you don't change parts or anything like that. I don't think it'll even mess it up if you change parts until you trigger something else. So once I get back to this one, I use another trigless trig and I set the rate back to 63 and then it starts up again. So you can see that happen right here.
I refuse to put my already vulnerable people in more danger by arming my music with aimless anger, activating them without taking into account that ammunition and violence is not taboo.
Yeah, so then I set these two to first so that they'll only happen the first time. How do you let it continue on to the next pattern? So if I don't do anything with this pattern, if I just move on to the next section, it will continue in the next part. The only reason that it doesn't is because I've actually gone in and created those slices for myself. Yesterday when I was working with the sample, I moved the way that I was triggering the sample so that there would be convenient pauses after this, and then I went in and created slices in pattern 3, 4, and 5, mostly because I'm getting into the stage where I want to practice a specific part more, and the more you do that, the harder it is to, you don't want to just like start from this point over and over and over again. If the point that you're trying to practice is like 2 minutes, 3 minutes later, or even a minute later. So I started splitting up my samples into smaller pieces. But if I didn't have this trig right here, it would still continue because they have the same part. And let me just remove this trig real quick. I'll copy it.
I refuse to put my already vulnerable people in more danger by arming my music with aimless anger, activating them without taking into account that ammunition.
So now that it's set to first, it'll skip over this time.
Anger is one stop on a train that is a range of emotions. It can be a start, but
so now we're on 4.
I'm angry.
And you'll notice that
this
is continuing to play.
What do I need more of to exist?
One of the big things about the Octatrack is that it doesn't it allows things to continue until a trigger interrupts it. So whatever command you last issued to a track, like setting the rate to 64 or 63, it'll just keep running that until something else interrupts it. And in a lot of ways, this can be unpredictable. Say, for example, if I like this trig, for example, I don't have to p-lock the rate to 63 again because it will default back to, like, anything that isn't changed, it will default back to. So whatever you p-locked before, if you p-locked rate to 0, once you introduce another trigger, it'll reset all of the settings to whatever is already there. I don't know if that answered your question, Nick. Maybe let me know if that was helpful. But I guess one thing that that kind of differs in what we were talking about the other day, where I was kind of using these samples to just play through multiple patterns. Lately, since I'm starting to get more comfortable with where I think the pauses should go and getting more intentional with that, where that is, it's kind of like, I know everyone who works with an Octatrack has probably dealt with some frustration when it comes to finishing or expanding ideas, taking something that's very small and making it bigger, making it more interesting. And for me, using like a long sample with a one shot with like a first conditional trig was my way of having something that I couldn't move around, and then just like finding ways to play with that without allowing myself to go in and get like really caught up in like the vocal editing or the chopping or anything like that, or even the warping. I can slightly slow down the rate, but to me that also like affects the sound of the voice. So it kind of keeps it as this like immovable object. And then over time, once I have something like, a 7 pattern arrangement, I can start going in and deciding exactly how I want that timing to go. So before, I was just playing the sample straight through, and then over time, I noticed that there was like that his hesitation in this section doesn't quite make sense. I'll show you what I mean. I'll play it right here.
I refuse to put my already vulnerable people in more
just gonna
danger
clear
by
these
arming
trigs
my
while it's
music
playing.
with aimless anger, activating them.
So notice that in that case, he goes activating that, activating them, and the activating them happens on like the third bar or the fourth bar. But I felt like it was way more impactful if things shifted back a little bit so that it felt like it was anticipating the next set of 4 bars. And that's just something that like I personally like, it's a taste thing for sure. But having the sample stay as this like single idea, and instead of going in and getting caught up in like the details of like how he should say it or anything like that, I just wanted to use these like broad strokes of just like slow, like pause it here exactly where he stops talking, and then extend his own hesitation further on.
I refuse to put my already vulnerable people in more danger by arming my music with aimless anger, activating them without taking into account.
And then it goes back into this
ammunition
section.
and violence.
And in fact, yesterday I recorded a video of myself doing this particular song, and I started this section with the sort of like that piccolo sounding thing muted.
I refuse to put my already vulnerable people in more danger by arming my music with aimless anger, activating them without taking into account that ammunition and violence is not taboo. Anger.
And to take you further on that journey of what I was doing yesterday, I was trying to figure out what makes this track interesting. And then, moving on to the next section, I noticed I kept having to play pattern 3 to get to 4. And so to give myself a shortcut, I started to create slices within the track that naturally, started exactly where they normally would. Except now, if I play pattern 3 and I don't move it, the sample will only play that as far as the length that I gave it, which is right before the next slice. So I'm slowly starting to build structure into these patterns. I think Hans asked a question. Do you go about deciding between flex and static sample management, as in how do you aesthetically make choices between the two methods of sampling? That's a good question. I've been considering a few different things. This is the first project I've had that I just naturally ran out of RAM space. So it's the first time I've actually had to consider economy in my file management. I tend to just put my largest samples in my static sample category. Anything that I'm planning on manipulating heavily with the crossfader, I try to put in the flex machine category, mostly because I've just heard that the crossfader handles them a lot better, and if they are in the RAM. So most of my stuff goes in the flex category. I just have a lot of longer samples like nature, field samples, recordings, people talking for like 2 minutes, 3 minutes at a time, or even 20 minutes, sound samples. I just throw those in. You also asked, do you generally keep samples continuing on to the next pattern on, or do you have that off in the settings? So I have it defaulted to continue on. Because it invites more accidents. It invites more accidental blending of things, which I think is pretty cool. There's a lot of times that I definitely wish it didn't happen, but I would rather manually go in and change that than the opposite, which is like remove the possibility of two things blending into each other. So yeah, I do default to that. There's actually a section in, I can't remember if it's this song or it's in the song that I am talking during. 'Cause
want to be here, and then the wanting takes me out. Intention can really spoil things, huh?
No wonder then that play should be taken playfully.
Rhyming words, riding alongside an unteachable moment.
Yeah, so this little section I created here, I'm really excited about because it's one of the few times on the Octatrack that I feel like my timing is involved in the process of shaping what's going on. I think like using the Octatrack for, how long has it been? Over a year now, maybe a year and a half. You start to anticipate where the one is every single time because it's like such an important part of how the Octatrack organizes information. It's like the sequencer is kind of the heart of what's going on here. I know a lot of people use plays free and stuff, but a lot of that stuff hasn't really crossed my personal experience with the machine. And I think it's like kind of a way of hacking. But for me, in this particular piece, which is one of the most recent ones that I made, I realized there were a few pieces that I wanted to use that didn't have tempos to them. There's a few samples that I recorded for a friend of mine that are just like these OB6 recordings that I made on my synth, and I made them for his little like radio show mix thing. Let me see if I can play this real quick. Hold on. Right. So I just played all these freehand, no tempo or anything like that. And the other thing like that I've kind of grown accustomed to is the fact that the Octatrack is not very good at time stretching. So I try to avoid time stretching as much as I can, either through slowing stuff down naturally through rate and making it pitch down, or just like leaving it unaffected completely. And for this particular track, I start with a sample that doesn't have a tempo, and I use sequenced elements that that don't feel rooted in like, so basically the sequence is secondary to a longer sample that's playing, which has been kind of a fun way to play with it. And then I go into a section that has like a very defined tempo. But then as I get out of that track, I did two things. I set the pattern settings chain behavior to the shortest possible amount, which is 2 out of 16. That's essentially a eighth note. And it's not instant, but it's close enough and it doesn't really matter. So basically I have, I know when it's supposed to happen because my vocal, there's a ding, which I did program in. I think it's,
I want to be here, and then the wanting takes me out.
It's right here.
Intention can really spoil things, huh?
But I also set my crossfader so that it would fade out everything else that was playing, except for that bell.
I want to be here, and then the wanting takes me out. Intention can really spoil things, huh?
So I can choose, at that point I can choose whenever I want to move on to the next pattern. Hitting it does not necessarily feel like I have to wait for the one, which it always does otherwise, because now I've set the pattern chain length to, or the pattern chain, what is it called? Just the snapping of that launch sequence. I've set it to the shortest value, so it kind of feels like I'm just telling it to play. And so it's kind of like this fun way to escape some of that feel of just having everything be, divided into 4, basically. What have you heard from others of why they choose to use Place Free? It's a good question. I actually, there's like one guy who messaged me and was like, what is your, like, he asked me about like a very specific question that had to do with Place Free, and I was just like, I don't know. I think a couple things I've heard that are pretty interesting are like, you can use neighbor tracks. You can Place Free neighbor tracks as if they are performance effects. So essentially, triggering, say track 2 is a neighbor track and it has a sequence that p-locks a filter or something like that. You can launch that on command, and that sequence will play independently of the sequence that you have playing, or it'll start and stop. Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, it sounds like there's some really cool things you can do. It's just not really how I'm envisioning my own usage. Maybe one day I'll get there. So, continuing from where we were talking about my track here.
I've been asked about anger a lot this week.
So this was like this and the one that I did with my vocal on it. Those are like the two more or less last things that I've been working on. And I started wanting to solidify how I would perform these and also how I'd perform them as a set. So my next goal is to export versions of these, basically perform them. And I have, I can go through my setup real quick, which is I have my Octatrack going into my mixer. The out of the mixer is going into an audio interface attached to my desktop. And I'm also monitoring through, I'm monitoring through the laptop, which is streaming. But that just this whole mixer setup lets me record everything that's going on, including the analog heat out into the computer. And then I'm going to record performances of these individual tracks. And I was kind of inspired by my friend who's asking for help with organizing an album. And he had like 10 tracks, and I just dragged a bunch of them into Ableton and tried like cross-fading them into each other. So I'm essentially going to do the same thing with however many pieces of music I have in here. And then we'll see how it looks on Ableton. And depending on how the order fits the best based on tempos and things like that, I think what I want to do is rearrange the bank so that it's chronological. The only problem with that is the file formatting that I did with my audio pool is not going to line up. At least mentally it won't, but I don't know if that really matters. Basically what I'm complaining about is the fact that I choose where I put my files in my audio pool based on which bank I'm using. So like bank 8 uses 81 through 90, bank 7 uses 71 through 80, and so on. But I think this far in the game, it's kind of already served its purpose in keeping things fairly organized. And if the end goal is to perform a set start to finish, I think it's more important to have things move chronologically, so I don't have to remember some 9-digit, combination to remember which one to play first. Or I could just remember it because it's not that hard. I mean, we're starting with 1.
This is a poem called Here.
For sure.
This is a poem called Here.
We'll see. We'll start by printing out some of these tracks. I've actually done a lot of these already, so as for what I'm doing on this stream today, I'll probably try to record some of the ones that I haven't yet and see how they fit in. The other predicament I'm kind of running into right now is that I have some beats on here that I haven't actually paired with any vocals. I just kind of made the beat, and because of that, they either feel non-essential or they feel like they're kind of in a different world. But I don't think that's necessarily because they are meant to be. It's just because like I don't have as much of an emotional attachment to them because there's no lyrics. So I kind of want to like explore that a little today as well and see if I can find some way to like use them, maybe just record them and see how they sound in the mix with everything else. That's probably what I'll do.
I want to think of quietude as an assemblage of bodies. And if I were to do that, I would be very much invited to notice that it can happen here.
That would be as simple as copy and paste.
I want to think of quietude as an assemblage of bodies. And if I were to do that, I would be very much invited to notice that it can happen here. This space of slowing down, this place of achieving rest, this place of critiquing or diffracting modernity, right in the belly of modernity, right in the city. Enchantment is never in short supply. And most of us are caught in the habit of thinking of escape as a way towards the sacred. That is, the sacred lies in the distance. If we can leave the mundane and the banal behind, then we will find the sacred. But I think the sacred is more pervasive, more fugitive than just something that is exterior to the conditions we want to live behind.
Cool. So that's the first recording here that I'm going to make. Still figuring out what to do with that beat because I just kind of made it one day. I like the sound of it. I definitely put a lot of energy into it, so I don't want to just throw it away for sure. But I also, like, I don't know. It's not really that exciting to me to just be like, to just have a friend rap on it, you know? So I think what I want to do is throw that into Ableton, smoke some weed, maybe jam to it, maybe just like figure out something more interesting to do with it than just like hand it off to somebody to make a vocal. But we'll see. I do have a few guitars in the back here. Drummer, Octatrack, and guitar going to Octatrack into an amp. Trying to Find balance between live instruments and working with electric track live. Have you ever messed with that balance? I have messed with that balance. I am not super accustomed with using the Octatrack for multiple instruments. I've plugged a mic into this by way of usually some kind of a preamp. I will say that without something like a fader Fox here, or something that can control, you can get like a Korg microcontrol, something that can give you some faders. I would recommend acquiring something that takes MIDI and allows you to control the levels of each track, just because it can become quite a headache if you have multiple parts. Like, for example, I have there are a couple ways you can route sound through the Octatrack. You can have it go direct in through this menu, this mix menu. The only problem is everything is panned in stereo by nature. I don't think you can actually unpan it in this version. So if I have I guess if you're going into an amp, it doesn't really matter. But if I plug a mic into input D, for example, and I turn up direct all the way, it'll play out of the right speaker only. The way to get around that is by creating a through machine, which you enter through, you give it a trig to start it, and you can set the let me just do it real quick. You can set the input specifically to input C or D, and then you can increase the volume. The only problem with that is that over the course of multiple tracks, multiple patterns, you will end up with different settings just by nature. Like, you'll accidentally save like a filter slightly lower than the next track, and you'll want to make sure that all of that stays consistent. So I would say keep a close eye on gain staging, on effects. Make sure that there's no sudden jumps in volume from one part to another, because the more inputs you use for the Octatrack, the more tracks you have to use to have control over those inputs, which means the more creative you have to get with the tracks that you actually do have available that aren't just, controlling the mic or the synth. So I would say decide on a configuration of a track that you can use for every single performance, and copy and paste that track into every relevant thing that you have. Another thing that I would advise is use the same track for your vocal, for your guitar, for your bass. This will help you in the future. Like say if you have 4 things, and the easiest way, and it might be a smaller amount of tracks for you, but if the easiest way for you to set up your inputs is by having at least 4 tracks available, I would say put them on the right side, let the left side be all samples or whatever, and keep the same ones for every single song, even across performances from one project to another, because I guarantee you will open a project one day and you will think it's one thing and it'll be something different because you forgot. Like, it's guaranteed to happen at least once or twice before you get used to it. But keep the same tracks, because later on, if you want to mute that track, like if you have a bassist there who has their own setup, you can just go ahead and mute the bass track and, perform with that person. Or you can set it up like I have right now, where it's muted and queued. So that means that I'm sending just this track out through the queue out. And that lets you record things separately. So that's a good jumping off point, because in this particular project I'm working with, my track 5 is the track I use for all of my vocal samples. Anytime somebody was recording something, I put it in track 5. And so my goal eventually with this project is, once I have the correct order of how I want to perform it, I play the whole thing start to finish, I record it, but I record it in 2 different files. My main out sends the whole instrumental, and my cue out will send my vocal. And so when I go into Ableton, I'll be recording 2 different stereo channels. And then afterwards, I can balance the vocals with what's going on. I can do at least a little bit of mixing after the fact. And then on top of that, I have an instrumental of the mix, which I'm really excited about because I want to take that instrumental and send it to my friends who wrote the original stuff that was recorded, and maybe see if they can write new songs to the beats that I've created. Because, I feel like one of the things that we're always kind of struggling with as songwriters and producers is like having something to interact with. Sometimes you get a cool idea together, but then it's only like 30 to 40 seconds long, and then it kind of like stagnates in this, limbo period where you have like one cool phrase and one cool loop. So I'm excited about the idea of having like a 30 to 40 minute mix with beats that are already structured around something, which isn't quite actually a song most of the time, because a lot of the time these were recorded to poems and stuff, and then have somebody write a song to it. That's something I'm excited about. The other reason, one last thing, because I have done this a lot, performed with vocals and stuff running through here. The other reason to keep your track, your vocal track on one thing, is if you're ever in a situation that has a mixer, which doubtlessly you will one day. If you're playing a gig where they have a mixer, even a 2-channel mixer like this, I can send the instrumental to one channel and I can send the vocal to another channel. And so if there's any issue with, feedback or whatever, we can go ahead and mix that separately. And like every sound engineer will thank you for giving them that versatility and giving them that option to do something without having to sculpt like the entire signal at the same time. Yeah, I would say as a person who does some live mixing from time to time, the number one thing you want is to be able to control the vocal separate from the main mix. So moving down this, yeah. So this next pattern that I have is another one that's just like a full instrumental. I have no clue what to do with it. The most that's come out of it so far is just a bunch of like cool Instagram stories. But I am really interested in it because I was kind of like inspired by listening to Ski Mask and some of this like modern reimagining of those old rave, old breakbeat, old fill type beats. I'll play the Ski Mask track again. I was just like really captivated by the cleanness of the beat, and was trying to think of like how I would recreate something like this in the Octatrack. And the idea of programming in the beat by hand is very unexciting to me. So I decided to revisit a video that I had done like a few months ago and try out this sort of LFO. Oh yeah, so the track is called Dial 274 by Ski Mask. I can link a YouTube video here. Well, I'll type it first. Ski Mask is really awesome if you haven't heard of them. Really, really intricate beats and cool, kind of like Aphex Twin sounding stuff. The whole album is worth a listen, start to finish. I think Resident Advisor gave like a review of it. The MIDI controller is called a Fader Fox PC4. Yeah, so that was kind of what prompted this particular track. What's funny is I always just end up using some kind of melody, which probably really like immediately separates the sound of this track from Ski Mask. Really what I'm looking for with this track is I really like the way it sounds already. So the question for me is, what am I building around? And that's, I think the reason that I'm having issues with it is because growing up listening to pop songs and listening to the kinds of songs that drew my attention, most of them were vocal based, vocal oriented, and so when I come across music like, you know, this techno world, I'm always like curious about how they maintain interest and maintain momentum without the aid of, you know, melodies and things like that. But they still manage to, which is kind of the thing I'm trying to crack still. And I'm also just looking to, I think my eventual goal with this track is to just give myself an opportunity to jam without the distraction of a vocal and just kind of like do stuff that's highly performative. Oh yeah, I'll check that out. 58 seconds. What's interesting too is that there's a lot of stuff out of time. You kind of hear these like weird spacey things that don't seem to have anything to do with the sequence. That's kind of like this, you know, continuing on, easy to remember type sequence. And then there's all these random kind of sounds going on, which I think is one of the bigger ways to create that sort of momentum, is to like build on those kind of energetic things. That being said, I think that the reason that I would keep this in my mix would be to give myself an opportunity, like I was saying, to perform more. So I kind of like, I've noticed that about this track is that like I want to control the knobs. I want to control the crossfader. The crossfader here is adjusting the start point, or is controlling the speed of the LFO. For that reason, I'm wondering if this loop is the right loop to be using. There's a good chance I will swap that loop out. Here we are in bank 3. Maybe swap it for something that's a little bit less predictable and not vocal. Ooh, it's tricky because I don't have a ton of those on here. Let's see. I do have some weird samples in my orphans folder. A lot of melodic stuff. Oh yeah, I love this sample. It's so weird. Maybe I'll do that. I've had that for years now. Also a good candidate. I mean, I think what I'm talking about here is more or less a similar concept to taking a poem, which doesn't have the timing of the octatrack, and just throwing it in and trying to build around it. It's the same thing, except instead of words, you're working with sounds. I actually have some, no, I'm not going to open my computer and import more files. There are plenty of files on my octatrack right now. I mean, like that already sounds cool. I'll go with that. Another cool thing that another cool thing that I noticed about this, by the way, and I kind of just want to share this this tangent real quick with you guys. I don't know if I've ever discussed this. I think I made a video on this actually, but anyway, I would set loop to ping pong, and then I would set the length to really low, turn on length time. and then I would just scrub between different parts of the sample. So let's say we create a part here, or a scene, sorry, where I just move the start point around. And we can adjust the length to taste depending on what we think sounds good, or we can go ahead and do something like, I think what I did last time was, what did I want? I don't like that it is triggering outside of where the triggers are. Yeah, so we're gonna double the length of the pattern, the master pattern. Actually, yeah, we're actually gonna extend this to an eighth. So this is gonna be twice as slow. So each one of these trigs is gonna be the length of 2 bars. Half a bar, sorry. Just kind of give you guys some context here. It's actually more interesting if there's a lot happening, because basically I slow it down by half and I use a really short value. And this is a fun way to rediscover some old stuff that you have. I'll put in something else, which this is how I was using it before. I would take old stems from tracks that I was playing, and I would throw them into this kind of like, into this track, which was just taking old slices, and I wouldn't have to slice it at all. I would just choose a start point, make it the lowest length, and unfortunately, because this tempo is so fast, it still takes a little bit more negotiating to figure out what's best. But what's cool about this approach is that you don't have to do a lot. You don't actually have to know what you're doing. You can just like slow down stuff a bunch and experiment. I remembered what I did. I turned off time stretching. So the reason why certain things like this don't work as well is because this particular noodling that I did doesn't have a particular key to it. So in this situation, using tracks that have like, you know, even an entire song, the chord progressions will work within a certain world, and then this essentially boils down that world into a few, you know, notes and chords that work together. So maybe if we try this one, and we're not going to use time stretch. Ah. Cool. Yeah, I'm kind of into that actually. Maybe not so much actually, but yeah, like I even created a way for myself to develop. What is this? Yeah, to develop like new ways to create interest for myself. So like, if I use the crossfader just for moving the start point of this track around, that's not gonna be, you know, super exciting for me. It's not very performative. It's kind of just like, oh, it needs to go here now. And I'm actually just moving them arbitrarily. It's more interesting for me to control the start point of this. So in order to give this more of like a story, I think what I did last time is I figured out where cool samples were, and then I p-locked them, so that each pattern would have its own kind of vibe. So like 92 is a good example. The other thing I did though last time was last time I had a square wave attached to this start point thing because I wanted it to jump between two different points. And I wanted it to do so halfway through this sequence, because then it would give me basically like a 4-bar phrase where the back half sounds different from the front half. And it didn't really matter to me you know, what two samples it was taking from. So we're going to test that out. Essentially, I'm taking a square wave. It's being applied to the start point. So in this case, the start point's 92. We're going to go back to ping pong looping. And I'm going to first figure out what the rate of this is right now by setting it to a basic multiple of fourth, 32 and 16. So notice it's jumping too quickly for me. Actually, and also I need to set this to analog, I think. Basically, I'm just trying to create some kind of structure that you can hear. The other reason I slowed it down by half is because I don't want you to be able to hear the tempo. Yeah, I'm kind of confused about the okay, let me just catch up on this real quick. Mike says the Octatrack will be delivered next week. Congrats. Yeah, thanks for checking out the tutorials. Got the whole family there. Exciting. I actually only have the Octatrack, so still just digging into this machine. I've been told multiple times that I'd love the Digitact, and I'm sure I would. But I think I'm still just like finding new ways to, and also playing with the limitations, the shittier time stretch and all that kind of has become a bit of a fun work through, or like a limitation to work with. Acridolaf, welcome back. Which track are we trying to modulate? Right, so I have this long stem, which is in my static machine, and this is an attempt to spice up this track that I had that has these break beats. And I've basically imported this instrumental, which by the way is in like 6/8 or 3/4, so it's like already kind of weird for, and the goal is not to use the goal is not to figure out how to make it work. The goal is to play around. So in this case, I am choosing arbitrary start points, and we're just going to turn off this LFO real quick. If I don't have slices enabled and I have length set to time, I can set a really low length. And basically I'm just choosing sections in the song. And hunting for parts that I like. Something I was also kind of exploring in the past with this was taking and so moving on to the LFO section here, one of the things that I experimented with a while back was just choosing a random LFO and telling it to pick a different spot at the start of the pattern. And I just wanted it to change, actually I want to set it to hold. So it'll basically just choose, if I set it to 127, actually I'll just set it to 112 because we don't need to get to the very end. And we go to, say this is 127, we go to 64, which is right in the middle. Now, this is going to randomize, actually it's going to randomize too much. Because it's basically going to change, I don't know how fast it moves right now because we're at, one time multiplier. So if I set this to 1, of course it's like at the very end. Why is it at the very end? Start point, multiplier, let's just increase this more. I'm trying to reduce the speed of this so that it repeats a few times. Cool, we're getting there. quite remember if this was how I did it, actually. Well, let's go back to the original kind of idea I was working on, which was basically, if the slices off the 127 range of the start parameter divides the sample, yes, it divides the sample, no matter how long it is, into 128 points. And then it picks one of them depending on which one you have activated. So what I'm trying to do right now is create, like if I don't have anything activated right now, this is just going to play start point 64 every time. That's what's confusing the hell out of me right now. What kind of start point square wave creates this pattern? One, two, 1, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So it starts with 3, and then it does 2, and then it does 2 for the rest of it, and then does 1. It's like, how did that happen if my speed is if my speed is 16 and my multiplier is 8? It doesn't really seem possible that would happen. This is what I was going for, though, and maybe we can just pretend that never happened. See, that's what I thought, right? Wavelength of the LFO didn't sync with the BPM, but I read in the manual that all of these values are synced with the BPM. So if you set it to 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, whatever, then that should be synced up along with the multiplier. So The gate nature of the square wave. Ugh. I could have sworn I've done this before though, and it's had no issue with that. I think it might have to do with just like the way I'm arranging these, maybe? I don't know. Then I just kind of exploring more. You find another 4 that you like. Yeah, so I mean, you can take this concept and I guess I'll do a quick recap also for my own sake, just to, you know, ground myself in what's happening here. I've taken a stem, an instrumental, and I am grabbing start points from it. I created a square wave that, you know, after tweaking a little bit and trying to figure out what's going on, I decided to settle on this, which essentially is just giving me a something to build around, where these two are the same and these two are a slightly different point. Based on the square wave, it'll basically select a point slightly below and a point slightly above where my start point is. If I don't like this one, I can just move my start point. I can also play with this in other ways, like maybe reduce the length. And I mean, you could even take something like, you know, a track like this, instead of doing it at a quarter speed, maybe we make it 4 bars. And I don't know if it'll play the same way. Yeah, it will. Nice. So if, say we were... This is telling me that the square wave is more or less synced up, so that one value is playing per 2 bars. So if I created a pattern around that, like this, sometimes it doesn't work. And with a long sample like this, you can play with low depth rates for this, because, you know, the difference between 77 and 78 is already like a decent chunk, you know, if I'm working with a 3-minute sample. This is another case where it might be helpful to have a neighbor track just so you can add a compressor or something, because it's kind of hard to, you know, to rein in what's going on this track with just 2 effects. And from this, you can also build, you know, additional LFOs. Maybe there's one LFO that, you know, builds a square wave on a bar by bar basis. So then you create another relationship between, you know, these tracks. I think what I'm going to do next is maybe... I feel like something like this would benefit from having Yeah, so this is the first time I've actually tried creating a long pattern like this that's like playing with what's going on in here. Because, the other crazy thing about this is I could just be jamming on this for, an hour or so, just kind of creating new possibilities, changing up the start point. Yeah, so that. I mean, like, finding ways where you have this as a pattern, like, one of the things that I've raged against for a long time with the Octatrack is like, I don't want to be performing and like figuring out what sounds good. I want to have there are better ways to serve the moment than, making P-locks while you're performing. I feel like, when it's something more immediate like this, it's more rewarding when you find it if you can just turn a knob and get different results. And again, I don't think the crossfader's best work is, moving it once and being like, oh, that's cool, and then moving it again whenever you need something different. I think it's much more helpful because it's such a comfortable thing to move around. It's way better served if you're using it like actively as like almost like an instrument or, something like that, rather than just like another knob or something. So I tend to use the crossfader for performative elements. And then when it comes to something like this, where I'm exploring what's going on, I can go in and, turn a knob here and there. And the reason why I set up that square wave is because if I don't move anything, there's already something kind of interesting going on. If I don't have the square wave, I have a single, sound sample, and there isn't a lot to attach my brain to. Like it'll get old because, 1 bar is the same as 4 bars. But creating a square wave that manipulates which sample is being triggered over, 4 bars, that creates something for your brain to attach to. Exactly, it's moving. So then you have something that you can mess with, and you can be like, okay, the stress is off of me to create something that's constantly moving. Like the machine itself is doing that. Now, how do I make that make sense? Like even something like that sounds really cool, and I don't have to mess with it. I can leave it for a second and let it kind of percolate in my mind and see if there's something I can add to that to help glue it together. And I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but that's kind of like one of my favorite things to do with the Octatrack, whether it's taking a poem and throwing it in and saying like, I'm not going to change this. What can I do around it to make it make sense? Or if it's like coming up with some sort of weird chord progression that sort of works with a bass line, and then figuring out what goes in between that to glue everything together. I think that's where I find the most enjoyment. So when I'm doing a performance like this, I want to fit myself into what's going on, and typically for me, I do that with the OP1 because it's such a boundless source of sounds and notes and stuff. It's pretty immediate. So, trying to avoid some of the more music theory based leanings, but still, it's helpful for me to have something that's like completely separate from the Octatrack to play with, so that I can add something at will to like glue everything together. Yeah, so we have, let's set this up as a through machine. I didn't even have my through machine set up like I was recommending. So if we were to take this and walk through, what's going on in my mind, I hear a bass line, and I think it's in C sharp. And then C. And then once I decide on something that I might want to use, maybe I just cut the low end a little bit. So that's one possible direction I could go with it. And I think the reason that I'm having difficulty settling on something is because here we're sort of running into a collision of worlds for me. I've used the Octatrack in two primary worlds. One is to perform something that I have an idea of how it should go, and then I kind of like print it into the Octatrack and find ways for myself to jam to it and stuff. And the other is kind of like this very anchorless but potentially infinite jamming stuff that was kind of inspired by watching Reggie Watts and watching how he does TED Talks and how he does jams, where it's like this guy could just keep going infinitely. Like watching him perform for an hour, you can tell that like he's only stopping because that's how long he's supposed to go. It's not like he had a projected start and finish to his set. And ever since I saw that, I was like amazed by that, and I knew that it wasn't necessarily coming from a place of preparation, like as far as like preparing that particular set. It was just like relying on his knowledge of music and his grasp of melody and harmony and stuff. So that's been my pursuit ever since seeing that. And once I saw the Octatrack, this was actually before I got the Octatrack, I was doing that with Machine, with Ableton, with the OP1, and my friend was on like a drum machine. But then when I saw the Octatrack, I was like, this is one potential way that I could actually do this live on my own And ever since then, it's been this kind of like ongoing journey of figuring out how to create that experience. But this beat is kind of in between because, you know, I think in order to create a contained experience, something that'll fit into a set like what I've been working on, I need the patterns to have defined points. They can't just be anything, you know, because then it's just like, you know, what am I going to do? Like, how do I know to go to the next part? And in the past, with each other track, I have some kind of vocal tying everything together. And then from that, I decide where I want the beat to come in and leave. But at the moment, this track is kind of like, you know, each of these is equally viable, and they're not necessarily like more energy or less energy. So I think what I need to do is figure out what things I'm going to play with live and what things are going to stay the same. I think it's going to take some more research, maybe not research per se, but it'll take a bit more active listening. And I think I'm going to listen to more Ski Mask and listen to some DJ sets, mostly tracks though, because the goal here is to make tracks and then tie them together. So yeah, I think I'm going to listen to more. If you have additional thoughts, leave them in the comments. Essentially, the next step for me is going to be structuring this particular instrumental into definable points that I can say, I'm done with this pattern. I know what's going to happen next. Because without a vocal, I don't feel that energy quite as strongly. And so I think what I'm going to do is listen to a bunch of instrumental electronic tracks and figure out where do they create that phrasing. Because right now, yeah, each of these patterns is kind of like, well, that one's different, but each of these patterns is kind of like similar, except for the first one, which I knew was going to be some kind of an intro, but I still haven't even fleshed that out. I'm actually really into what just happened there. So before I leave, I'm going to go ahead and save that by setting this to 64, setting this up a little bit, and then putting an LFO on the length of the reverb. I'm into that so far. I'm liking the way it hits my ear, but again, yeah, like the structure of it. And yeah, like Nick was saying, sort of telling that story, finding something that has a tried and true structure, trusting in that. That's kind of where a lot of the previous structures have come. Whether it's writing from somebody who's used to writing, like a lot of the people that, almost all of them that I've been working with for these poems, they're songwriters. So even if they're not trying to write a song, there is some kind of an arc to their thoughts. And so I've been kind of like building around those. And over time, once I start to get a sense of, where certain pockets of energy are, then I, like I was showing Nick and you guys earlier, I was like delaying the moments so that they would fit those pockets that I have in here. And I think with regards to something like this, it could be as simple as having a vocal, but I do think that adding a vocal it would create a certain kind of experience, and I'm looking to break out of that a little bit. I'm looking to break out of the song structure a little bit. So I think in this case, maybe trusting in a different kind of structure, maybe taking like, you could do something like find stems from a electronic track that you like, or a Beatles song that you like, and take like just the bass line, or take just the drums and build around that. And you would have something that's, already informed by an understanding of structure, and then sort of like throw your own kind of flavor into it. So all that to say, I'm going to do a bit more research and listen to some more music and see what kinds of structures I can pick up on. A lot of what I do here is heavily informed by what I'm doing as a listener, listening to my favorite songs, things that are exciting to me. Eric Pryd's Opus. I have heard that song. It's a good one. I will send a couple things to you guys on chat, which relate to things that I'm interested in musically right now. Has anyone heard of Clark? I think I might have mentioned Clark before. But Nick, when you said the thing about music being kind of like a story, it reminded me of Clark, because I was listening to a Resident Advisor interview with this producer who's been making music ever since, the Aphex Twin days and stuff. And it's pretty abrasive stuff a lot of the time, but actually Clark's musical style ranges so far. It's something that I identify with a lot and am inspired by, because his most recent album was like an instrumental, just like, I think it was on piano or something. It was very acoustic, and yet like his early stuff is like really hard, dry electro techno type stuff. And I've been kind of like drawn to this album that came out in 2008 called Turning Dragon. I will link that in the YouTube comments. And this is somebody who is classically trained as well. But it's interesting to imagine somebody who's classically trained making music like this, because I always felt like classical music was kind of a prison when it comes to electronic stuff. But that's Clark's album, Turning Dragon, something I'll be, I think, checking out this week. I've also really been enjoying Feist's most recent but old album, Pleasure. I don't know if I'm going to be drawing on that structurally as much, because I think for a long time, I've been wanting to crack this sort of like the secret behind electronic music structure. Not that I have to do it that way at all, but I'll link that too, because the reason I thought of this album, Pleasure, is because I signed up for like a movement class on Instagram. It's actually held through Zoom, and Yeah, actually, Nick, I love Todd Terje as well. Um, but there was the movement class was centered on how do you create intimacy, how do you create closeness or simulate closeness, like in a time of self-isolation. And one of the questions on the form was, for sign up, was what is a song that evokes closeness for you? And I immediately thought of this Feist album for some reason. I think it's just like the production on it that feels very like unproduced even. It's obviously done very carefully, but you know, they leave a lot of the low end in her voice and it just sounds very intimate. So those are two very different albums for you guys to check out if you're so inclined. I guess other news, I'm thinking of starting a Patreon. A lot of my friends are. If that is at all interesting to you, leave a message in the comments and let me know if there are certain things that you would like to see from a potential Patreon from me, things that interest you about this video chain. It's pretty clear to me that this type of video is not for everyone, so I'm not really trying to offer a bunch anyway. I'm just trying to figure out what would be helpful to people and what people would be interested in seeing more of. So if you're one of those people who's interested and curious about being connected more, I know some people have been asking about the samples that I've been using. I have to make sure I can clear permission with the people involved, but if I can, I would love to offer that as well. So yeah, thanks for supporting. Thanks for saying it's a good idea. You know, it's like I'm still trying to figure out how to like set it up and make it make sense with, you know, what I'm already doing. But yeah, if you I think the more suggestions I get about what kinds of things you would be interested in seeing, the more I can kind of shape. And I'd super appreciate if you guys are interested, like having that interaction with you and testing it out, because I'm completely a stranger to it. I always feel weird about turning these off because I feel like there's like a little community growing every time I stream these, so I don't want to like cut you guys off. But I will see you on Friday afternoon, 2 p.m. PST, and have a great rest of your day.